On Christmas Eve, a young waitress named Maya slipped a quiet warning beneath a stranger's coffee saucer. He looked like just another tired man in a plain coat, the kind people forget before the door even swings shut. She refilled his cup with steady hands and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then left him 2 words written like a prayer. "Help me." Maya never suspected that the stranger was Ethan Cole, the billionaire owner of the diner, sitting there undercover to learn why his business was collapsing. And she couldn't know that this small, trembling choice would pull both of their lives toward a truth that refused to stay buried. The diner buzzed with low chatter and clinking cups, warm on the surface, uneasy underneath. Outside, snow fell in slow, patient sheets, turning the windows into frosted mirrors that swallowed the streetlights. Maya told herself it would be just another late shift, bad tips, tired smiles, the same holiday music on repeat, until something humiliating unfolded in plain sight. Curtis Hale, the manager with a polished grin, made a show of collecting tips into a locked drawer as if it were policy, his voice honey-smooth and his eyes sharp. When a server hesitated, Curtis leaned in close, and the room seemed to hold its breath the way a person does before a blow. What Maya had done wasn't about money, and it wasn't even about winning anyone's sympathy. It was about dignity, about asking for help in the only safe language she still had: silence. Ethan kept his face calm, the way a man does when he knows panic will only feed the danger, but inside him something went still and cold. He had come expecting laziness, petty theft, maybe a manager cutting corners to pad a paycheck. Instead, the note in his hand felt like an alarm, and the diner's warmth began to feel less like comfort and more like camouflage. He lifted the cup as if nothing had changed, letting the steam hide the tightening of his jaw. In the dark window, he studied reflections instead of faces, catching a man in the back booth who never touched his food, only watched the room as if counting mistakes. Curtis's heavy keyring swung at his belt with a dull jingle, a small sound that carried too much authority, and Maya's shoulders tightened every time it passed. When she reached for the cream, a bruise flashed at her wrist beneath the cuff of her uniform, quick, almost missed, like a secret that didn't want to be seen. Then Ethan noticed the back hallway door with a new deadbolt, far too strong for a diner, and he understood that some doors were locked for reasons no menu could explain. Maya came by again, pouring coffee with the careful grace of someone trying not to tremble, and their eyes met for the briefest moment. In that glance, she didn't ask him to be a hero. She begged him to be wise, to see without exposing her, to move without tipping the room into violence. Ethan felt the urge to stand, to declare his name, to end it with power, but power could get her hurt faster than fear ever had. So he stayed seated, ordinary and quiet, and let the enemy believe nothing had changed at all. And as the Christmas lights above the counter flickered once, just once, Ethan realized someone was already watching him watch them. Ethan didn't let the note change his posture, not even by a breath, because he could feel the room measuring reactions. He folded the paper once, small and neat, and let it disappear beneath his palm, as if it were a coupon he didn't plan to use. The coffee was bitter, but the bitterness now had meaning, like a warning you taste before you understand. Across the counter, the Christmas garland drooped in tired loops, and the lights blinked with the stubborn cheer of something pretending. In that thin, forced warmth, Ethan realized silence wasn't absence, it was strategy. Maya moved from table to table with practiced steadiness, the kind that comes from learning how to survive under eyes that judge. Her smile appeared on schedule, then vanished the moment she turned away, as if her face had 2 lives. Ethan watched her hands, careful with the cups, careful with the plates, careful with the air itself, like one wrong sound could summon trouble. When she reached for the sugar caddy, the bruise at her wrist showed again, dark against her uniform, and then she tugged the sleeve down with a motion too quick to be casual. It wasn't just pain on her skin, it was a message written in purple that someone wanted her quiet. He used the window like a mirror, studying what people thought they were hiding. The man in the back booth sat with his shoulders relaxed, but his attention was sharp, drifting from the register to the hallway to the staff with a patient hunger. Near the kitchen, Curtis Hale laughed too loudly at something that wasn't funny, the way a man does when he needs everyone to believe he's harmless. His key ring clinked as he walked, a small metallic rhythm that announced him before he arrived, and Maya's body reacted to it before her mind could pretend. Ethan's heartbeat stayed steady, but his instincts rose like a tide. A customer at the counter complained about the price of pie, and Curtis handled it with syrupy charm, offering a discount that sounded generous and felt rehearsed. Behind that smile, Ethan saw the same cold math he'd seen in boardrooms, control disguised as kindness, power hidden inside politeness. Curtis leaned close to another server and spoke low, too low to hear, and the server's eyes dropped as if the floor were safer than his face. Ethan could have ended it in one sentence by saying his name, but he remembered how authority can turn a bully into a weapon when corners feel threatened. So he stayed ordinary, watching for proof, watching for the moment that wouldn't get Maya punished for trusting him. Maya returned to Ethan's table with the coffee pot, and for a breath, her hands trembled, then steadied again, as if she had yanked herself back from the edge. She didn't look at the note, didn't look at the hallway, didn't look at Curtis, only at the rim of the cup, focusing on something she could control. Ethan gave her a small nod, nothing heroic, just the quiet kind of promise that doesn't draw attention. But in the glass behind her, he saw the man in the back booth shift, as if he'd noticed the tiniest change in the air. And Ethan understood that if he misread even one detail tonight, the cost would not be money, it would be her safety. Ethan kept his hands around the mug a little longer than he needed to, because the warmth pulled an older night out of him. Years ago, before anyone knew his name, he had walked into a diner like this, with no coat, no money, and too much shame for a kid to carry. The place had smelled like grease and coffee and safety, and an older cook had slid him extra fries without a single question, as if kindness could be given quietly and still count. He remembered sitting in the corner booth, chewing slowly, trying to make the comfort last, and promising himself that if he ever climbed out, he'd return what was given. That promise was the real reason he bought this chain when success finally came, even though his advisors called it sentimental and unnecessary. He told the board it was a solid brand with community roots, but the truth was softer and more stubborn than profit. He kept a framed copy of the original menu in his office, not as decor, but as a reminder of what dignity looks like when it's served on a chipped plate. So when the numbers started bleeding, missing deposits, sudden resignations, inventory adjustments that didn't add up, he felt it like a personal failure. It wasn't just a business slipping. It was a place that once protected the weak, now quietly harming them. That was why he came on Christmas Eve in a plain coat and a forgettable face, determined to see the truth without the filters of managers and reports. He expected burnt coffee, tired staff, maybe a supervisor skimming cash and blaming the economy like everyone else did. Instead, he received Maya's note, and with it the kind of fear no spreadsheet could measure, the kind that makes a person beg for help without making a sound. He watched her move through the tables like someone walking on thin ice, careful not to crack anything that could swallow her. And he understood with a sinking clarity that this diner wasn't collapsing from laziness, it was being controlled. Every detail around her started to look like evidence. The way she avoided the back hallway, the way her eyes dropped when Curtis passed, the way her smile appeared and vanished on command. Ethan felt guilt rise in him, sharp and unwelcome, because he had been absent behind glass towers while people like Maya carried the cost of whatever was happening here. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, turning the world into a blurred painting, while inside the Christmas lights blinked with a cheer that felt dishonest. He told himself to stay calm, to stay slow, to let the truth reveal itself without putting her in immediate danger. But the more he watched, the more he realized patience would only work if the enemy didn't notice he was watching back. Then, as Curtis crossed the floor and the keyring at his belt chimed softly, Ethan's eyes caught a flash in the window's reflection, one of the men lingering near the back. It was small, almost nothing, just a mark on the hand as the man adjusted his sleeve, but it landed in Ethan's mind like a stone dropped into still water. A tattoo, simple and familiar, the kind private security reports mention when they don't want to write the whole story down. Ethan's throat tightened as recognition turned into certainty, because he had seen that mark before, and it meant this wasn't just a diner problem anymore. Ethan forced his breathing to stay even, because recognition could be louder than any confession if it showed on a face. The tattoo in the window's reflection dragged an old file up from memory, one of those quiet security briefings that used careful words instead of ugly ones. He didn't stare, didn't stiffen, didn't give the man the satisfaction of being noticed. Instead, he turned his attention to the diner the way a chess player studies the whole board, not just the piece that threatens the king. If that mark meant what he feared, then someone here wasn't just stealing, someone was organized. He began with the simplest weapon, small talk that sounded harmless. When Maya came near, he asked about the holiday rush, about the schedule, about whether the owner ever showed up, and he kept his tone mild enough to be forgettable. Maya answered politely, but her words were careful, shaped as if each syllable had to pass an invisible inspection. Curtis hovered nearby, the way a shadow does when it senses light, smiling too wide, listening too closely, making sure no conversation wandered where it shouldn't. Ethan could feel it. This wasn't management, it was surveillance wearing an apron. Curtis Hale finally approached Ethan's table like a man greeting a regular, all-warm voice and practiced charm. He introduced himself as if the diner were his personal kingdom, then asked Ethan where he was from, what he did, how long he'd be in town, questions that sounded friendly until you noticed they were really a search for leverage. Ethan answered with half-truths that fit his disguise, letting Curtis believe he was nobody important, nobody worth fear. But Curtis's eyes flicked to the back booth before returning, a silent check-in with the man who never ate. Power here didn't shout, it coordinated. Then the front bell chimed, and a local police officer stepped in, shaking snow from his shoulders like he belonged to the place. Curtis greeted him with easy familiarity, laughing as if they shared jokes no one else was allowed to hear, and poured him coffee without asking. The officer ate, lingered, and left without paying, not even pretending to reach for his wallet, and Curtis watched him go with a satisfied calm. Ethan felt something in his stomach harden, because protection like that didn't come from kindness. It came from arrangement. If the wrong badge was already in Curtis's pocket, then calling the usual authorities could be the fastest way to get Maya hurt. Maya passed Ethan again, and her eyes brushed his for the briefest instant, just long enough to carry a message she couldn't speak. Ethan gave her nothing dramatic, only a small, steady look that said he was still listening, still careful, still in control of himself. Behind her, the back hallway door sat like a sealed mouth, the deadbolt catching the light whenever someone moved nearby. Ethan pretended to sip his coffee, but his mind settled on one truth. To save her, he would need proof strong enough to survive corruption, and he would need to find out who Curtis was truly answering to before the night ran out. Ethan decided to test the diner the way you test ice before you step fully onto it, carefully, with something small that could reveal where it was weak. When Maya returned to his table, he paid in cash and let a few extra bills sit on the edge like an accident, then watched without looking like he was watching. Maya's fingers hovered for a second, as if she wasn't sure what she was allowed to touch, and then she slid the money into her apron with a movement so fast it looked trained. But she didn't smile in relief. She looked past Ethan toward the counter, as if waiting for someone to notice. Curtis noticed. He didn't rush over, didn't make a scene, didn't raise his voice the way careless bullies do. He simply appeared beside the register, smiling like a man welcoming customers, and held out his hand toward a young server who had just finished a table. The server dropped a small pile of bills into Curtis's palm without argument, her eyes fixed on the floor. Curtis slipped the cash into the locked drawer with the ease of routine, then patted the counter as if he'd done nothing more than straighten napkins. The humiliation wasn't loud, but it was total, the kind that teaches people not to resist, because resistance is expensive. Maya tried to step away when Curtis called her name, her shoulders tightening before she even turned around. He leaned close enough that Ethan could see Maya swallow hard, and Curtis's voice dipped too low for words to carry, but the threat in it didn't need sound. Maya nodded once, small and obedient, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten behind the steam of his coffee. This wasn't a manager correcting a mistake. This was a man reminding her who owned her fear. Ethan's eyes flicked to the holiday wreath on the door, bright red ribbon against worn glass, and the contrast made his stomach turn. The diner looked festive, but the cheer was only paint over rot, decorations hiding the fact that the air inside was held hostage. He realized the missing money was only the surface layer, the part that could be explained away with audits and excuses. The real crime was the way Curtis had shaped the staff into quiet, compliant pieces. And Maya somehow was both a target and a warning. When Maya passed Ethan again, she didn't speak, but her hands trembled as she poured coffee into an empty cup she didn't need to fill. Ethan kept his voice low and gentle, asking if she was okay in the same tone a stranger might use out of politeness, nothing that would set off alarms. Maya's eyes flicked to the back hallway, then to the man in the booth, and then back to Ethan with a fear so controlled it looked almost calm. Ethan understood then that if he moved too fast, Curtis wouldn't just punish her, he would make an example of her. And as Curtis's key ring jingled behind the counter, Ethan felt the first true wound of the night open in his chest. The certainty that Maya's note was only the beginning. Ethan felt his pride rise like a reflex, the old instinct that said power could solve anything if he used it loudly enough. He could stand up, say his name, demand the keys, and watch Curtis's smile crack in front of everyone. But he didn't. He had seen what men like Curtis did when they were cornered, how they turned fear into punishment, just to prove they still controlled the room. So Ethan swallowed the urge, kept his shoulders loose, and let himself look like nothing more than a quiet man nursing bad coffee on a cold night. He reached for his phone under the table, thumb moving with the calm discipline of someone who had learned to hide decisions behind ordinary gestures. He didn't call the local police, not after the free meal and the easy laughter at the counter. Instead, he sent a short coded message to his head of security, enough to activate a background check without raising alarms, enough to bring in eyes that weren't tied to this town's smiles. His pulse stayed steady, but his thoughts sharpened, arranging steps the way a man arranges prayers when he doesn't know what else to do. Tonight wasn't about winning. It was about getting Maya out alive. Maya moved through her tables like she was carrying something fragile that could shatter if she breathed wrong. Ethan watched how she avoided the back hallway, how her feet slowed for a fraction of a second whenever she neared that deadbolted door. The lock was new, metal too clean against old paint, and it didn't belong in a place built for pancakes and families. Curtis walked past it once and tapped the doorframe with his knuckles as if checking his own property. Maya didn't look at him, but her spine stiffened anyway, as if her body remembered pain even when her face refused to show it. Ethan forced himself to stay patient, even as anger pressed against his ribs. He asked for another coffee just to buy time, just to keep himself seated and close enough to see patterns. From the corner of his eye, he tracked the man with the tattoo, the way he shifted his posture whenever Curtis spoke to staff. It wasn't random. It was coordinated, like a guard responding to signals no one else could hear. Ethan realized Curtis wasn't acting alone, and that meant authority wouldn't scare him, it would provoke him. The safest path was proof, the kind that couldn't be denied, the kind that could stand even if someone tried to bury it. When Maya returned to Ethan's table, her smile appeared again, thin and practiced, but her eyes carried exhaustion that looked older than her age. Ethan wanted to tell her right then that she wasn't invisible to him, that help was already moving, that she had done the hardest part by daring to ask. Instead, he simply thanked her in a soft voice and let his gaze drop back to the cup, because even kindness could be dangerous if it looked like a signal. Across the diner, Curtis's key ring chimed as he turned, and Ethan felt the room tighten like a fist. He understood now that pride could wait, but timing could not, and whatever was behind that deadbolt was running out of it. Maya crossed the floor with a tray held a little too high, her shoulders stiff the way they got whenever Curtis's keys jingled. Ethan watched her through the harmless veil of his coffee steam, letting his face stay slack and forgettable. The diner's Christmas music kept playing, cheerful and wrong, like a smile painted over a bruise. Curtis stood near the register with that polished grin, scanning the room as if he owned the air itself. And in the back booth, the tattooed man sat still, eyes open, waiting. The tray tipped as if by accident, plates sliding, coffee spilling in a dark rush across the tile. The crash snapped heads around, chairs scraping, voices lifting in irritation that sounded normal to anyone who didn't know fear. Maya dropped to her knees instantly, apologizing too fast, hands moving to gather shards before anyone could accuse her of being slow. She leaned close to Ethan's shoe as she reached for a broken cup, her breath shallow and hurried. "Don't look up," she whispered, so soft it could have been part of the clatter. "He's counting." Ethan kept his gaze on the mess, forcing his body to stay loose, even as his instincts screamed to move. In the reflection of the window, he saw Curtis shift his weight, the way a man does when a plan has changed. The tattooed man's eyes flicked once toward Maya, then back to the room, as if checking whether the disturbance had revealed something. Ethan felt the trap tightening, not in chains, but in a tension, in the sudden focus that lands on a person like a spotlight. He understood that Maya hadn't dropped the tray because she was careless. She had dropped it because time had run out. Curtis stepped forward with false concern, his voice warm enough to fool a stranger. "Everybody relax," he said, smiling as if this were just holiday chaos. "We're closing early tonight, staff meeting in the back for inventory." The words sounded ordinary, but the way the servers' faces drained told the real meaning. One by one, the employees began moving toward the hallway, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, like people walking toward something they didn't want to name. Maya's hands trembled as she rose, and Curtis's gaze pinned her with a quiet warning. Ethan stayed seated, because standing now would be a flare in the dark. A young server tried to slip a phone into her pocket, and Curtis caught it without even turning his head, as if he'd been watching her all along. "Policy," he said mildly, holding his hand out until she gave it up, the smile never leaving his face. Then he reached for Maya's phone too, and Maya hesitated for half a heartbeat, long enough for Ethan to feel danger spike. She handed it over with a small nod that looked like obedience, but her eyes flashed once toward Ethan, pleading without words. The tattooed man shifted in his booth, and Ethan knew the room had become a cage with a holiday ribbon. Even the blinking lights over the counter seemed to watch. Ethan's mind moved faster than his body, calculating what he could do without igniting the wrong kind of attention. He couldn't call for help in front of them, and he couldn't follow the staff into the back without being noticed as the odd piece on the board. He slid his hand into his pocket and pressed his phone screen against his thigh, typing a single coded line to his security lead without lifting it into view. The message was short, ugly in its simplicity. Lockdown risk. Possible hostage. Do not alert locals. His heart stayed steady by force because panic would be a gift to men who thrived on it. Then the Christmas lights flickered, once, twice, and the diner went dim for a breath that felt too long. In that thin pocket of darkness, sound sharpened, and Ethan heard it clearly. A muffled cry from behind the deadbolted door, cut off as if a hand had covered a mouth. Maya froze near the hallway entrance, her chin lowering as if she'd been struck from the inside. Curtis didn't react with surprise. He reacted with annoyance, like a man hearing an appliance misbehave. Ethan's stomach dropped because the sound wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a living person. When the light steadied again, Curtis's smile returned as if nothing had happened, but the room felt colder despite the heat. The staff disappeared down the hallway one by one, swallowed by the back like a secret being locked away. Maya glanced over her shoulder once, and in her eyes Ethan saw the exact shape of her fear. Not just for herself, but for someone she couldn't protect alone. Ethan remained in his booth, the role of ordinary customer burning on his skin, because any sudden move could make the crying stop for good. And as the deadbolt clicked faintly somewhere in the back, Ethan understood with brutal clarity that the night had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Ethan didn't leave like a man walking away from a bad cup of coffee. He left like a man stepping out of a burning house without letting the flames see his face. Outside, the cold hit him hard, sharp enough to clear the diner's heat from his skin, but not sharp enough to clear the sound he'd heard behind that deadbolt. The parking lot was a wide sheet of snow and dim streetlight, peaceful in a way that felt like a lie. He got into his car and closed the door slowly, as if even the click could be overheard. For a moment, he just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at his own breath fogging the windshield. His mind replayed Maya's whisper, "Don't look up," like a command etched into bone. He saw Curtis's smile again, too smooth, too practiced, and the way the tattooed man had watched without blinking. Ethan had dealt with ruthless people in conference rooms, but this was different because the stakes weren't numbers. The stakes had a voice, and it had cried out from behind a locked door. His first impulse was the simplest one. Call the police, bring sirens, end it fast. But the image of the officer leaving without paying cut through that impulse like a blade. If Curtis had friends wearing badges, a call could travel straight back to the diner before Ethan even finished speaking. Worse, it could land on Maya's shoulders like punishment for daring to ask for help. Ethan imagined Curtis hearing about a concerned customer and turning that concern into a reason to tighten the leash. So Ethan did the hardest thing for a man used to control. He waited and he thought. He checked his phone under the glow of the dashboard, reading the short reply from his security lead. Understood. Team moving. No locals. The words should have comforted him, but they didn't, because comfort required certainty, and tonight had none. He watched the diner's back door from across the lot, seeing a shadow pass once behind a frosted window. Somewhere inside, Maya was being pulled into that hallway with the others, forced to pretend it was inventory while fear did its work. Ethan felt anger rise again, hot and immediate, and it took all his discipline not to march back in and tear the deadbolt off with his own hands. The anger didn't last, not in its pure form, because beneath it lived something heavier: guilt. He had built an empire on the idea that work could be safe and fair. Yet here, under his own sign, someone had turned employees into prey. He thought of the boy he used to be, the one who survived because a cook offered extra fries without asking questions, and he felt the weight of what he owed. This wasn't just a failing location on a quarterly report. This was a place where kindness had once mattered, now twisted into a trap. Ethan bowed his head for the first time that night, not because he wanted to look noble, but because he didn't know what else to do with the fear pressing against his ribs. The prayer that came wasn't polished or impressive. It was a quiet plea for wisdom and timing, the kind of prayer a man whispers when pride finally steps aside. He asked for Maya's safety, for her brother, whoever he was, wherever he was, and for the courage to do this without making her pay for it. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, turning tire tracks into disappearing lines. In that hush, Ethan understood he wasn't fighting a single man. He was fighting a system built to keep victims silent. When he lifted his head, his reflection in the windshield looked older, not from age, but from responsibility settling into place. He wrote down details while they were fresh: Curtis's full name, the officer's face, the tattoo's shape, the van behind the building, the deadbolt's brand, if he could remember it. He sent another coded message: need federal contact, possible coercion trafficking, evidence being gathered. His hands didn't shake as he typed, but his stomach did, because he knew what that kind of message meant. It meant this wasn't ending with an angry confrontation. It was ending with a careful rescue. Ethan started the car, but didn't drive away, not yet, keeping the diner in view like a lighthouse you fear might go dark. He told himself the team would arrive soon, that proof would be collected, that the right people would step in quietly and cleanly. But the truth was, he didn't know what was happening to Maya in that hallway at this very second. He didn't know whether the muffled cry would turn into silence for good. And as the diner's Christmas lights blinked on through the snow like nothing was wrong, Ethan felt the deepest doubt of the night settle in. Timing was everything, and he was already afraid he was late. Ethan waited until the diner's side door opened for a trash run, just once, just long enough to see a sliver of the back hallway without stepping into it. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of grease and bleach, and for a heartbeat he caught Maya's silhouette near the doorway, still standing, still moving, still alive. That single glimpse steadied him more than any promise could, because it meant the night hadn't swallowed her completely. He stayed in his car, hidden behind a veil of falling snow, watching like a guard who couldn't wear a uniform. And then he saw the cook, older, sturdy, moving with purpose, slip out into the night. Mrs. Delaney didn't look around like a thief. She looked around like someone checking for wolves. Her hair was tucked under a knit cap, her hands red from heat and soap, and she carried a small paper bag, as if she were only taking leftovers to the dumpster. But when she reached the shadow of the building, she paused and turned her head toward Ethan's car, not with surprise, but with recognition. Ethan opened the door and stepped out just enough for her to see his face in the dim light. Her eyes narrowed, then softened in a way that felt like time folding over itself. "You came back," she said quietly, as if she'd been waiting years for those words to be true. Ethan didn't correct her or ask how she knew. He simply nodded, because explanations were dangerous and because she had already chosen to trust him. Mrs. Delaney kept her voice low and her body angled toward the diner, as if she could feel eyes behind the walls. She told him the staff weren't just being cheated, they were being trapped, threatened with debts that appeared out of nowhere, debts that never shrank no matter how hard they worked. "They keep you tired," she whispered, "and they keep you scared, and then they tell you you're lucky to still have a job." Her mouth tightened, and Ethan could hear the anger she'd been swallowing for a long time. When Ethan asked about Maya, the cook's gaze dropped to the snow, heavy with something like sorrow. "That girl's carrying more than trays," she said. "They've got her by the throat, and it isn't even her throat they're squeezing." She explained it carefully, as if naming it too plainly might make it real enough to strike. Maya's younger brother had been pulled into the web, used as leverage to keep Maya obedient. If Maya spoke up, if she ran, if she went to the wrong person, the punishment would land on someone she loved. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not with surprise anymore, but with clarity. This wasn't just theft, it was coercion. Mrs. Delaney reached into her apron and pulled out a worn recipe book, the cover cracked from years of heat and handling. She opened it to a middle page, and inside, tucked like a confession, was a folded slip of paper. Numbers, dates, names, amounts that didn't match any normal order list. "I've been keeping what I can," she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. "I don't know who to give it to. The wrong person smiles, and then you disappear." Ethan took the paper like it was fragile, because it was. Fragile in the way truth always is when it's surrounded. In that moment, he wasn't just a billionaire with resources. He was a witness being handed proof. Ethan promised her he would move quietly, and he would move right, not fast and reckless. He explained in careful pieces that outside eyes were coming, people who weren't tied to this town, people who couldn't be bought with free pie and easy laughter. He told her there would be a plan, secure evidence, get Maya out safely, find the brother, and collapse the operation without warning the men running it. Mrs. Delaney listened without interruption, the way someone listens when they've waited too long for competence. When he finished, she nodded once, small but firm. "Then don't let her be brave alone," she said, and the words landed like a moral command. Before she returned inside, she gave him one more piece, almost as an afterthought, almost like she hated herself for not saying it sooner. "That van behind the building," she murmured, "it doesn't belong to any supplier we use." Ethan's eyes lifted toward the back lot, and through the snowfall he saw it again. Engine idling, fake logo, no warmth in its windows. The night suddenly felt narrower, as if the world had tightened around a single point of danger. Ethan thanked her, and she disappeared back through the side door like a woman stepping into a storm she couldn't avoid. And as the diner's lights blinked on through the snow, Ethan understood the ray of hope had a shape now, proof in his pocket, an ally in the kitchen, and a reason to move that was no longer just business, but life. By the time the snow thickened into a steady curtain, Ethan had turned fear into a list of quiet actions. He arranged help the way a careful man arranges dominoes, so the first one can fall without warning the last. A private investigator arrived in a delivery jacket that looked ordinary enough to be ignored, carrying boxes that held more than food. Small cameras were tucked into objects nobody questioned. A phone charger, a pen, a cheap keychain left near the counter like forgettable clutter. Ethan didn't want a dramatic rescue that could explode into violence. He wanted proof that could stand like steel. He also scheduled a vendor audit for dawn, using the kind of official language that makes people straighten their posture without knowing why. It was simple on paper, routine, boring, corporate, but it gave him a legitimate reason to bring in outside eyes without tipping Curtis off too soon. At the same time, Ethan's security lead made a quiet call up the chain, reaching for contacts who didn't share coffee with local managers. Every step was designed to keep Maya from being singled out as the leak, because Ethan understood the cruel truth of workplaces like this. When predators sense danger, they don't fight fair. They punish the weakest first. Near midnight, Ethan returned to the diner, not as a savior, but as the same tired customer who belonged nowhere. He pushed open the door and let the bell announce him in its harmless little voice, then stepped into the warm air as if nothing had happened. Curtis glanced up with that smooth smile, and for a moment it looked like he relaxed, the way a man does when he thinks he's watching a harmless stranger. But the tattooed man in the back booth shifted his posture, subtle as a shadow moving across a wall. Ethan felt it immediately. The room remembered him. Maya was behind the counter now, wiping the same clean spot, as if motion could keep fear from settling. When she saw Ethan, her eyes widened by a fraction, and hope flashed through her so quickly it might have been imagined. She didn't smile, because smiling could be a signal, and signals could become accusations. Instead, she set a mug down with careful hands and kept her gaze on the rim, as if the coffee mattered more than her own life. Ethan took his seat like a man settling into routine, but his heart tightened because he could see how hard she was working to look normal. A person shouldn't have to perform safety like that. The investigator entered a few minutes later with a box of pastries, nodding to Curtis as if he'd done this 100 times. Curtis greeted him with casual authority, signing a receipt, asking one extra question too many about where the delivery came from. The investigator answered smoothly, unbothered, and moved on, leaving behind a small device under the counter with the ease of a man placing a napkin. Ethan watched Curtis's eyes track the delivery man's path, lingering a beat longer than comfort would require. Curtis's smile stayed in place, but the muscles under it tightened, like a door being quietly locked. Ethan understood that Curtis didn't need certainty to react. Suspicion alone could be enough. Outside, through the front window, Ethan could still see the van behind the building, engine idling, as if it never slept. Snow gathered on its hood and melted in patches where warmth rose from beneath, giving it the unsettling look of something alive. The logo on the side was clean and generic, the kind that could belong to anyone, and therefore belong to no one. Ethan's security lead texted one line, "Plate confirmed fake." Ethan didn't flinch, but inside him something turned cold again, because fake plates meant planning, and planning meant this wasn't a single man's scheme. Maya wasn't caught in a mess. She was caught in an operation. Ethan kept sipping his coffee, letting the diner believe he was just another lonely customer killing time on Christmas Eve. But as Curtis walked past, the key ring chiming softly, Ethan caught a change in the man's gaze, quick, sharp, aimed at the counter where the investigator had stood. Curtis paused, as if listening for a sound nobody else could hear, then turned his head toward Maya with a look that wasn't quite a smile anymore. Maya's shoulders tightened, and Ethan felt the room shift, subtle but undeniable, like a storm changing direction. And in that moment, Ethan realized the most dangerous part of the night was beginning, the moment Curtis started to wonder who exactly had brought trouble to his door. The next hour moved with the slow dread of a clock you can hear but can't stop. Ethan stayed in his booth, shoulders loose, eyes lowered at the right moments, giving Curtis no reason to label him as a problem. He watched the staff drift behind the counter in small, tense motions, like people trying to look busy while listening for danger. Maya kept wiping the same section of laminate, her breath shallow, her gaze never lingering anywhere that could be questioned, and every time Curtis's keys chimed, the whole room seemed to tighten around her. Mrs. Delaney slipped out of the kitchen when she could, moving like a woman who knew how to pass messages without being seen. She came to Ethan's table with a basket of napkins, set it down as if it belonged there, and kept walking. But as she passed, she let something fall into the space beside Ethan's cup, thin paper folded twice, hidden beneath a corner of the placemat. Ethan didn't react until she was gone, then opened it with the smallest movement of his fingers. It wasn't a note like Maya's, it was a receipt, ordinary in shape, deadly in meaning. The receipt was marked with numbers that didn't belong to inventory, and names that didn't belong to any vendor list. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read, because one name sat there like a clean suit in a dirty room. Someone respected, a familiar figure from charity dinners and community speeches, the kind of person who posed for photos beside donation checks and talked about values into microphones. Ethan felt his stomach drop, not because he hadn't expected corruption, but because this corruption wore a smile the town trusted. It wasn't just Curtis skimming tips. It was a network that knew how to look harmless. Ethan kept his face blank as he tucked the receipt into his pocket, but his mind raced ahead, connecting threads. The idling van, the deadbolt, the officer's free meal, the tattooed man who watched like hired patients, all of it suddenly fit. Curtis wasn't simply running a scam, he was enforcing it, and enforcement meant muscle, leverage, and silence. Ethan's phone buzzed once with a message from his security lead. Name on receipt matches civic donor. Also appears in your investor registry. Ethan's throat tightened because the betrayal had crossed into his own house. Maya approached Ethan's table with a fresh pot, and for a moment her hands steadied, as if she'd decided to risk one more truth. She didn't speak at first, just poured, eyes fixed on the dark stream of coffee. Then, without lifting her gaze, she whispered, "It's not just money," so softly it could have been mistaken for breath. Ethan didn't answer, because answers could be traps, but he held still in a way that invited her to continue. Maya swallowed, and the next words came out like they hurt to carry. "They have my brother," she said, and the world inside Ethan shifted. He felt the weight of that sentence settle into his chest, heavy and immediate, because it explained everything Maya had been hiding in her posture. She wasn't only afraid for herself, she was being controlled through someone she loved, the cruelest kind of leash. Maya's eyes flicked toward the back hallway, toward that deadbolt that didn't belong in a diner, and then back down to the cup as if looking anywhere else would be dangerous. Ethan understood in a single sharp moment that this wasn't a workplace complaint waiting for HR. This was a life being traded for obedience, and it had been happening under his name. Ethan held the mug as if it anchored him, because he needed to stay steady when every instinct was screaming to move. He couldn't promise Maya safety out loud. Promises could be overheard, twisted, used against her. But he gave her a look that carried one clear message: "I believe you, and I'm not leaving you alone in this." Maya nodded once, almost invisible, and stepped away before Curtis could wonder why she'd lingered. Ethan's phone buzzed again with a final update that turned suspicion into certainty. "Donor is scheduled to arrive tonight." And as the bell over the diner door chimed softly, Ethan realized the night was about to reveal its true face, one that might already be standing in the snow outside. The bell over the door chimed again, and the cold air that swept in carried more than snow. A man stepped inside with a scarf neatly wrapped and boots too clean for the weather, the kind of person who looked respectable in a town that trusted appearances. He greeted Curtis with an easy familiarity, like they shared a private language, and Curtis's smile sharpened into something proud. Ethan kept his eyes half lowered, letting the man pass as if he were invisible to him, but inside, the receipt in his pocket burned like a warning. This was the donor Mrs. Delaney had named, the clean face of a dirty machine. The donor slid into a booth near the window and spoke softly to Curtis, and the tattooed man in the back shifted as if receiving permission to relax. Maya moved behind the counter with her head down, shoulders tight, careful not to be drawn into whatever conversation was unfolding. Ethan watched the donor's hands, noticing how they never trembled, how they rested with the calm of someone who believed consequences belonged to other people. Curtis laughed once, too warmly, and Ethan caught the faintest glimpse of an envelope changing hands near the register. It was quick, practiced, and ordinary enough to fool anyone who didn't know what to look for. Ethan's phone vibrated beneath the table, one short buzz, then another, the signal they had agreed on. Team in place, outside officials arriving, hold. He didn't move, didn't react, simply took another sip of coffee, like a man killing time on Christmas Eve. The investigator in the delivery jacket lingered near the pastry case, pretending to check a receipt while his camera caught everything. The devices were already recording Curtis's drawer, the envelope, the donor's face, the tattooed man's watchful posture. All Ethan needed now was timing, because timing was the difference between justice and chaos. It happened with the kind of quiet force that feels unreal until it's too late to deny. The door opened, and two men entered in plain coats, followed by a woman who carried herself like authority without needing to announce it. They didn't wear the local warmth of small-town policing. They carried the clean, distant calm of people who weren't part of anyone's friendships here. Curtis stepped forward instantly, smile ready, voice honey-smooth, asking what they could do for our valued guests. The woman's eyes didn't soften, and her identification appeared like a blade, brief, unquestionable, and not interested in charm. Curtis tried to laugh it off, tried to make it sound like a misunderstanding, but the room had already changed shape around him. The investigator calmly produced copies of receipts and timestamps, while one of the officials asked to see the tip drawer and the back office records. Curtis's smile held for another second, then tightened, his gaze flicking toward the donor as if waiting for rescue. The donor stayed seated, face composed, but his fingers tapped the table once, fast and anxious, betraying the first crack in his confidence. Ethan remained in character, because the safest moment to reveal himself was still not the first moment. It was the moment that protected Maya. Maya froze behind the counter when the official's eyes swept the room, and Ethan felt the danger spike in her body before it reached her face. The woman agent stepped toward her with a gentleness that didn't weaken her authority, speaking low, offering protection without demanding a performance. Maya's throat bobbed as she swallowed, eyes glassy with fear. Then she nodded once as if her body had been waiting for permission to stop pretending. Curtis started to protest, voice rising, stepping toward her with the reflex of ownership, but one of the men blocked him without drama. And when Curtis's keyring hit the counter with a hard metallic clatter, the sound felt like something breaking that had held the whole room hostage. Only then did Ethan stand, slow and controlled, letting the diner see him as more than a tired customer. He didn't posture, didn't gloat, only looked at Curtis with a calm that carried consequences. "This ends tonight," he said, his voice steady enough to be mistaken for coldness, though it was really restraint. Curtis's eyes flashed with anger, then fear, and the donor's face went pale as recognition spread through him like poison. For a brief moment, Ethan saw what they truly were. Men who had counted on silence, now exposed under fluorescent light. But even as Maya was guided safely toward the front, Ethan's mind stayed anchored to the sentence that mattered most. "They have my brother." Proof could be gathered, arrests could happen, papers could be signed, yet none of it would mean enough if that boy was still locked somewhere in the dark. Ethan watched Maya step into the snowy air, shaking but free, and he felt relief, then immediately the sharper edge of dread, because Curtis could be restrained here and the donor could be unmasked here, but the brother was still a question mark out in the night. And Ethan understood that the most important door of all hadn't opened yet. Outside, the snow met Maya like a cold blanket, and she drew her arms around herself as if to hold her body together. The female agent kept close, speaking in a low, steady tone, the kind that doesn't demand strength but lends it. Maya's face was pale under the diner's glow, and her breath came in short bursts that turned to fog in the air. Ethan stepped out behind them, careful not to crowd her because even rescue can feel like threat when you've been trapped too long. He watched Maya's eyes dart toward the backlot, toward the idling van, and he knew her fear wasn't finished yet. Curtis was still inside, restrained and shouting in a voice that sounded smaller now, that it no longer controlled anyone. The donor was being questioned in sharp, calm sentences, his composure cracking like ice under weight. Ethan didn't linger on their downfall, because justice wasn't a spectacle to him tonight. His focus narrowed to the one thing Maya had whispered that mattered more than money, more than dignity, more than the diner itself. "Your brother," he said quietly, keeping his voice gentle. "Tell me everything you can. Where they took him, who drives, what they said." Maya shook her head once, tears filling without spilling, and the answer in her eyes was the cruel one. She didn't know enough. The agent's radio crackled with brief updates, and Ethan caught fragments, units moving, plates checked, addresses pulled from files recovered in the office. Mrs. Delaney had been right. The receipts weren't just numbers, they were a map. Ethan's security lead arrived in an unmarked vehicle, stepping out with a calm that looked like confidence, but was really preparation. He spoke quickly with the officials, handing over additional documentation, images of the fake plate, a record of unusual vendor payments linked to Curtis. The donor's name was already being traced through accounts and shell companies, and the net was tightening in places the town couldn't see, but the brother was still a living question, somewhere beyond the diner's lights. Then one of the officials emerged from the back hallway, carrying a small notebook and a set of keys taken from Curtis. "We found a list," he said, voice controlled. "Addresses, shifts, pickup times." Ethan's chest tightened as the words landed, because lists like that didn't belong to normal businesses. Maya flinched, as if she recognized the shape of her own nightmare in those details, and the agent's hand found her shoulder, steady and protective. Ethan leaned in to read one line, and there it was, an address scribbled beside a note that made his stomach turn. "Kid, midnight transfer." Midnight was already passing. Ethan didn't hesitate, not with pride, not with speeches, not with the need to look heroic. He made one decision and turned it into motion, telling the officials he would not interfere, only assist where allowed, only provide resources and support. A small team moved immediately, not sirens and flashing lights, but quiet cars cutting through snow like shadows. Maya was guided into the back seat of a warm vehicle, blanket around her shoulders, hands clenched in her lap like she was holding her own heartbeat. Ethan sat in the front passenger seat of another car, staring ahead through the snowfall, feeling the weight of every second in his bones. He had built a life where delays could be tolerated. Tonight, delays could kill. At the address, a plain building crouched under winter darkness, its windows dull, its parking lot half empty. The team moved fast and quiet, lights off, voices low, every step measured to avoid spooking whoever was inside. Ethan stayed back because he understood boundaries, but his whole body strained forward, as if willpower alone could open locked doors. A muffled sound came from somewhere within, a thud, then a small, frightened cry, and Maya's breath caught behind him in the car. The agents entered, and the night held its breath again, the way the diner had held it before a blow. Minutes felt like years, and then the door opened. A boy stepped out, wrapped in an oversized hoodie, face red from cold and fear, eyes wide with the shock of sudden freedom. Maya stumbled forward before anyone could stop her, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, arms reaching as if she'd been torn in half, and finally found the missing piece. When her brother ran into her, it wasn't dramatic. It was desperate, quiet, real, two bodies clinging like survivors in a storm. Ethan looked away for a moment, not out of distance, but out of respect for a reunion that belonged to them. Later, when the boy was safe and the officials were finishing what needed to be finished, Ethan finally spoke words he had held back all night. He told Maya who he was, not as a reveal meant to impress, but as a truth meant to reassure. "I own the diner," he said softly, "and I'm sorry you had to bleed under my sign." Maya stared at him, disbelief fighting exhaustion. Then something in her expression softened. Not forgiveness yet, but the first step toward it. In the falling snow, Ethan understood that recognition wasn't applause. Recognition was responsibility, and tonight he had finally chosen to carry it the right way. The weeks after Christmas didn't feel like a victory parade. They felt like a long exhale that kept catching halfway, because bodies don't forget what they had to endure just because the danger has been removed. Maya moved through each day as if she were learning the shape of normal again, testing quiet moments the way you test water with your fingertips after being burned. Her brother slept in short stretches, waking at small sounds, then pretending he hadn't, because pretending was the only skill he'd been allowed to practice. Ethan watched them with a tenderness that carried no pity, only respect, because survival is its own kind of courage. Ethan didn't treat the diner like a project to fix and move on from. He treated it like a home that had been violated and needed protection, not paint. He replaced management, brought in independent oversight, and set up anonymous reporting that didn't root through local hands. He raised wages, secured tips, and made the rules simple enough to understand, because confusion is where predators hide. And he did it quietly, without press releases, because dignity matters most when nobody is clapping. Maya was offered time off, counseling, a safe place to land, things she had once believed were luxuries for other people. She took them slowly, because trust doesn't return on command, and help can feel unreal when you've been trained to expect strings. Some mornings she woke with her heart racing, convinced she heard Curtis's keys in the hallway, only to find nothing but wind against the window. Some days she flinched when a door closed too firmly, then hated herself for it, then remembered she didn't have to apologize for scars. Healing wasn't a clean line forward, it was a gentle, stubborn decision made over and over. Ethan visited the diner after hours, walking the quiet dining room like a man walking through memory. He thought of the cook who once fed him extra fries, of the boy he had been, and of how easily a safe place can become dangerous when good people feel powerless. He spoke with staff one by one, listening more than talking, not as an owner collecting feedback, but as a human being trying to atone. Mrs. Delaney's eyes held him accountable without cruelty, and he accepted it because accountability is how forgiveness becomes real. The diner began to feel different, not because the walls changed, but because fear no longer sat at every table. One Sunday evening, Ethan invited Maya and her brother to a small Christmas service at a local church that kept its doors open for anyone who needed warmth. It wasn't grand, just candles, old hymns, and the soft murmur of people holding their lives together. Maya hesitated at the entrance, scanning faces the way she used to scan exits, but the air inside was gentle, and nobody watched her like she was something to control. When the candles were lit, the room glowed in quiet gold, and the flame in Maya's hands shook at first, then steadied. Ethan sat a few pews behind, not to supervise, but to give her space to breathe without feeling alone. During the final hymn, Maya's composure finally cracked in the safest way possible. Tears slipped down her face without embarrassment, not loud, not theatrical, just the honest release of a heart that had been holding too much. Her brother leaned into her side, small and tired, and she wrapped an arm around him like a promise made in flesh. Ethan looked at the rows of candles and thought how fragile light is and how stubborn it can be, refusing to go out even when the world has tried. In that moment, the word home didn't feel like a building or a job. It felt like safety, and safety felt like grace. After the service, people greeted one another softly, wishing peace, as if peace was something you could offer like bread. Maya stepped outside into the cold night air and let it fill her lungs, as if she were proving to herself that she could breathe freely. Snow dusted the church steps, and the town looked almost gentle again under the streetlights. Ethan walked beside her, saying very little, because sometimes the best comfort is quiet company. Maya glanced up at the sky, and for a moment her face looked younger, lighter, as if she could imagine a future that wasn't shaped by fear. Then her phone vibrated in her coat pocket, a small, sharp interruption that didn't belong in a peaceful moment. Maya frowned, pulled it out, and stared at a message from an unknown number, her fingers suddenly numb around the screen. Ethan saw the color drain from her face before he could see the words, because terror announces itself in the body first. The message was short, casual, and cruel in its simplicity. "You think it's over?" Maya stood on the church steps with the cold biting her cheeks, staring at the message as if the words could reach out and grab her. For a second, her body went back to the diner, back to that hallway, back to the sound of a deadbolt deciding her life. Ethan didn't snatch the phone or demand answers. He simply moved closer, steady as a wall, and looked at the screen with her. The threat was brief, almost lazy, and that was what made it dangerous. It sounded like someone who believed fear still belonged to them. Maya's fingers tightened around the device, and her breath turned shallow, but she didn't run. Ethan asked for one small thing, spoken with calm precision. "Don't reply." He didn't want her words to become bait, and he didn't want whoever sent it to hear her panic through silence. Instead, he stepped aside and made a quiet call to his security lead, giving the number and the timestamp, then letting professionals do what pride never could. Within minutes, the phone was in safe hands, the metadata preserved, the threat treated as evidence, not destiny. Maya's brother held her coat sleeve like a child afraid of losing a parent in a crowd. Ethan watched them both and understood that healing sometimes means learning you don't have to face the dark alone. The trace didn't lead to some dramatic stranger in an alley. It led to something uglier in a different way. One more thread from the same network. A man who thought intimidation could survive accountability. The message was meant to reopen the wound, to make Maya doubt her freedom, to make her shrink back into silence out of habit. But this time, fear had a name, a file, and a trail of digital footprints that didn't care about small-town loyalties. Quiet arrests followed, not for show, but for safety, the kind that removes danger without turning victims into headlines. When Maya learned the sender had been identified, her knees almost buckled, not from weakness, but from the shock of seeing consequences finally land where they belonged. She cried that night, not because she was broken, but because she was beginning to believe the world could be fair. Months passed, and the diner slowly became a place that felt honest again. Not shiny, not perfect, but warm in a way that didn't require pretending, with laughter that sounded real instead of forced. The deadbolt was gone, the back hallway repainted, the office audited, the tip drawer replaced with transparent systems nobody could twist. New managers were trained to protect people, not control them, and staff meetings were about schedules, not fear. Even the Christmas lights looked different when nobody flinched beneath them. Maya returned on her own terms, working fewer shifts at first, learning to trust her instincts without letting them cage her. She studied in the mornings, quiet classes, steady goals, because she wanted a future that didn't depend on pleasing someone dangerous. Her brother went back to school with support that didn't feel like charity, just the basic care children should never have to beg for. Some days were still hard. Trauma doesn't vanish. It loosens its grip slowly. But the hard days no longer ruled her life, and the good days began to outnumber them. When she smiled now, it reached her eyes. And it wasn't an act. Ethan did what he should have done from the beginning. He treated workers' safety as sacred, not optional. He funded counseling for staff, created a local program to help employees trapped by coercion and debt scams, and partnered with outside oversight, so no single-town relationship could bury a complaint. He didn't announce it as a grand gesture, because he'd learned that the purest help doesn't need a microphone. Mrs. Delaney stayed in the kitchen, still steady, still watchful. And this time, her watchfulness felt like protection, not exhaustion. Ethan visited often, not as a king checking his kingdom, but as a man keeping a promise to his younger self. On Christmas Eve, 1 year later, Ethan walked into the diner openly, without a disguise, and the bell over the door sounded the same simple welcome. Maya was behind the counter, calm and confident, and when their eyes met, there was no fear in her expression, only recognition, like two people who survived the same storm in different ways. Ethan ordered coffee, paid, and left a tip that wasn't about showing wealth, but about honoring worth. Outside, snow fell softly again, and the world looked peaceful without feeling false. The moral settled like warm light in a cold season. Real wealth is the courage to protect the vulnerable when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.